Okay, so today is Wildcrafting with trees, and this was really, I wanted to combine the fact that we just celebrated Earth Day, and then later in this week, we're going to be celebrating Arbor Day. So, what better way to combine it than learning about the cool uses of trees? However, many people are already really aware of the kind of ecosystem services that trees have. We're aware of the fact that they produce oxygen and habitat for animals. So I wanted to kind of talk about something a little more unique, and that happens to be all of the incredible uses that trees have for wildcrafting. So, welcome for those who do not know me or this is their first time watching a presentation with me. My name is Marissa Jacobs, and I have this little business called the Art of Ecology, which blends, as the name implies, some sort of creative endeavors with the environmental sciences. And so, through these presentations, I try to get people to be inspired and empowered to go outside, learn more about the habitats around them, as well as how we can utilize it for wildcrafting purposes, or how we can be conserving and protecting these valuable ecosystems through creative endeavors. So today we are doing that by looking at wildcrafting. I have a couple of other events coming up, both in person and virtual. If you are local, I would love to see you. All right, so today though, we're going to talk about first how we identify trees, because if you're going to be utilizing them, you want to know what you are utilizing. We're also going to talk about the history and ethnobotany of trees, and ethnobotany just means how do people interact with the plants around them. We're going to talk then about edible and herbal tree uses, as well as practical kind of applications and uses of trees. And then finally, we will wrap up with sustainable harvesting techniques, because if again, we want to be conscientious stewards of the environment. We want to make sure that we are being as ethical and sustainable as possible. And I did say finally, but last, I have a little cocktail recipe utilizing trees that will be in bloom, not quite yet, but coming up. So this helps you stay on the lookout for these types of trees in your area. Identifying. So there's a couple of things that we want to make sure that we are aware of when we are talking about why is identification really important in wildcrafting, right? We're not talking about really in-depth science and crazy scientific nomenclature, things like that. But we do want to know, are the trees that we are looking at native or invasive? What part of the tree is usable? What does sustainable harvesting look like for that particular species? Because it might change again depending on what portion of the tree we are using. So once we know what trees we have, we can figure out what equipment are we going to need for harvesting, as well as what does sustainable harvesting look like. So, four basic things to identify trees. First, we want to look at the leaves. So, things like leaf shape, structure, arrangement. Is it an opposite versus alternately arranged leaf? Those are going to be really valuable tools, provided the leaves are there. So, this is not going to be helpful in the winter. But right now, it's going to be a great, really quick tree ID characteristic. However, again, as I'm saying, winter comes, fall comes, the leaves are falling off the trees, getting blown around all over the place on the ground, or they are now under a layer of snow. We can't really use them. So utilizing bark, or I'm going to skip over to number 4, the overall kind of shape and structure of the tree are going to be really helpful, because those are going to be there all year round. So bark texture, the color of it, if it's flaky or exfoliating, or if it's smooth, those are all going to be really helpful. You can actually find some field guides that are just for tree bark. They're not necessarily going to include the leaves or the shape, because again, bark is a really key and year-round characteristic to use. In the spring, right now, though, we can utilize flowers. And as we go around looking at the different trees, what's in bloom, we can figure out, oh, this tree has this type of flower, or it's in this shape and style or color, or it has conspicuous versus inconspicuous or kind of invisible to the human eye or not really noticeable flowers. So, for example, all of the ornamental flowering trees right now have really easily identifiable flowers like our eastern redbud and sweet crabapple, Callery pear, magnolia. We've got a ton right now. Later on in the season, as those flowers, those really big flashy ones, kind of fade and disappear, we might see a lot of other flowers or know about some other flowers. For example, the black cherry has flowers, but they might not be as large as crabapple or magnolia might be. In the summer, late spring, early summer, we can see the tulip poplar with their humongous orange and yellow flowers, but they're really, really high up on the tree. They might be a little hard to get unless you are on a hill and the tree is growing and we're at the top of the hill and we can just kind of reach out and pick, or if a flower for some weird reason in the wind or storm damage falls off, and we can utilize them. And again, as I mentioned, examining the shape can be very helpful as well. For example, a lot of conifers have a more triangular or conical shape to them, whereas deciduous trees have more of, if we think about a little kid's drawing, more of a lollipop shape where it's one stick and then a more rounded canopy. But we can break it up even further. For example, if we look at the base, we're standing at the very, very base, the trunk of an eastern white pine, and you look straight up, you're going to notice that the branches are arranged in the spokes of a wheel all the way up the tree. If you look at a swamp white oak, you may see that it's this big chunky base and the branches spread out really far and they're kind of curvy and wavy, and the main branches are also rather large. These are just some little tips and tricks. This can all be found though in a field guide. So, not something you absolutely need to memorize if you don't want to. It would be helpful, but practice with a field guide does make perfect. So, if you're looking at leaves, we've got, again, a lot of different ways to utilize leaf shape, color, size, all these different mechanisms to identify a tree. And again, during the growing season, this tends to be the most beginner friendly for identifying trees. Are they simple or compound? A simple leaf is going to be a single leaf, what we think of as a maple, single leaf attached to a petiole, or that funny little stem that connects the leaf to the branch or the twig. And then we have compound, and this is going to be more like the sumac that's pictured here, black walnuts, ashes, and they are going to be one long kind of midrib right in the middle, one long stem, and then little leaflets that protrude off of it. So that entire structure is a single leaf with multiple leaflets. Then we can figure out, how are the leaves arranged around the twig? In this image here, I'm showing the maple, and you can see the twigs themselves are also oppositely arranged, meaning that on the main branch, there's going to be a node or an area where more growth occurs, further twigs, more leaves, flowers, whatever further growth is happening. And at that node, there is one directly opposite from one another. In most plants, though, it's going to be alternate arranged. So at a node, there's going to be a single branch, a further node up, and a single branch coming out the other side. Mad Horse is a really great kind of little mnemonic device to help you remember as you're out, you're hiking, and you're like, oh, this is actually oppositely arranged. I know that there are very few. Maple, ash, dogwood, so that's mad, and then horse chestnut, so mad horse. Those are going to be our oppositely arranged leaves here in Pennsylvania. So that can help you really narrow things down. And then looking at overall width, what do the margins look like? For example, this is an image of a Japanese maple. It has tiny little teeth, serrated edges, whereas the middle image is a sugar maple. So they're both maples, but the leaf structure looks very different. You can even have a tree called the silver maple, who again has very maple-like structures, those 5 primary lobes, but they look more fern-like or feathery in the fact that they have within each individual lobe more tiny serrations that like cut in deeper. So we can take a look and have all of those characteristics in combination help us identify. When we're examining bark and twigs, we can look for the texture. Do they have ridges? Do they have furrows? And one of the purposes of tree bark is to direct water. So a lot of those trees that have like ski slope shaped furrows in their bark, as the rain hits the canopy, it will travel down those ski slopes. It'll be directed and go right to the roots where the tree needs it the most. Bark can, like exfoliating bark here, that peels off naturally, can help to prevent too much fungal growth or mites, pathogens, pests. They just naturally fall off of the tree and keep all of the pores, called lenticels, free and unclogged by having this exfoliating bark. So here in Pennsylvania, we have things like the eastern red cedar, river birch, sycamores. Think of those huge plates of sycamore bark that can fall off. And then finally, this is a little more advanced, but we can look at leaf scars along the twigs. And this is where in the fall, or due to storm damage, the leaves fall off and leave a scar behind. They leave that connection point you can actually see. So here I'm pinching a willow twig, and right before my thumbs, you can see a kind of raised knobby little area that has like a circle and a circle inside of it. And that little section, right before you get to my thumbs there, my thumb pinching that twig, you can see the leaf scar. For the most part, leaf scars are going to change depending on the tree species because leaves connect a little bit differently. So you can, in the fall or the winter, look at where those scars are, look at the shape of the scar, and be able to distinguish and identify the tree from there. So now we're on to trees and people. So we've got lots and lots of uses of trees, lots of ecosystem services that make them incredibly valuable. One of them being providing shade and insulation for our homes. So it actually reduces, having trees around reduces energy costs. They reduce crime rates. So you can actually see a visual difference of the amount of trees in low income versus middle or high income areas. And the amount of trees directly correlates to the economic and social structure of these little neighborhoods. So that's a really incredible thing to take a look at. But beyond all of their ecosystem and social kind of services that they have a lot of practical uses that have been used throughout time. So I have some little bits of history of how people have used trees specifically. And this is just a tiny little fraction of tree uses throughout all of time. But this kind of still gives an idea of all the cool ways that trees can be utilized. So first, in the Amazon River Basin, basket weaving was a huge part. You would make your baskets and then go foraging, right? Hunter-gatherer type of societies need the baskets to put things in. How do you make the baskets? Well, you find tree branches or you find bark that is peeling off of a tree. You can pound that bark to make it really kind of leathery instead of hard and crunchy. And then that leathery substance was torn into long strips. And those long strips could then be woven together to create these baskets. very similarly to how in North America, Canada, and the United States, canoes were made. So you would get your paper birch trees and spruces. Not only could you cut down the tree and then like hollow it out with the hammer and chisel, but you could also utilize the exfoliating birch bark to create these long, almost strips of canoe sides. And so you could cut it to the shape that you wanted, canoe shape, right? Make the sides and use the spruce tree roots to sew. So instead of using like a textile fiber to sew things together, the spruce roots were really thick, really sturdy, and could secure the birch pieces together. Then using a sticky substance somewhere between a liquid and a solid, you could use tree pitch. So it's kind of like a sap that then you could seal all of those seams now. Because as you sew, you poke holes, right? And you don't want your boat to have holes. So you use that tree pitch, which then dries. So you're not picking your canoe up and getting sticky stuff all over you. You let it dry. And now your canoe is watertight and extremely lightweight. In Eastern Asia, so think of Japan, Korea, the island areas, Indonesia, Southeastern Asia area, bark was actually turned into clothes. And in Japan specifically, there is a traditional cloth making called Nibutani Atushi, which is specifically utilizing a tree called the Manchurian elm. And what they would do is similar to the other cultures, you could pound the bark to make it nice and supple. And then you could grind it down. And instead of making long, thick strips to make a basket with, you would make really, really tiny strips to make a thread with. And eventually, then you could roll that thread into like a ball of string and use that string then to weave clothes and create cloth. So this is still produced today. If you were to head over, this is a very traditional art form with some really cool utilization. In Europe, we start to see more of the use of medicine give rise. So we have I can never get the right syllables on his name. Hippocrates and Galen were Greek physicians who wrote a ton of things called Materia Medicas, which are kind of like a very specific field guide that you can create yourself, right? And say, here's this plant, I'm identifying it, I'm adding a sketch so you can see it. This way before photography, right? And they would document, here are the benefits, the medicinal benefits of this specific plant. And as they were traveling either with Greek or Roman soldiers, you could have this like medicinal field guide that you made so you know the plants really well. You can share it with others and discover how we can be treating the people around us medicinally. They were some of the first to document the use of willow bark. And willow has, the scientific name for willow is Salix, Salix. That's willows in general. Sounds very similar to salicylic acid. And that's why they were named such, is because willow is chock full of salicylic acid, which means that when you chew on the bark, it acts as a natural pain reliever and anti-inflammatory, which is what Tylenol is made of. So it's a really, really cool kind of progression of seeing how historically people would just chew on the willow bark, and now we have pharmaceutics that have created these substances. So as we look at edible and herbal trees, I'm going to kind of give a disclaimer. I am not your doctor. So when I say the herbal benefits and medicinal benefits of plants, this is supposed to be educational as ways for you to support your body and your well-being. However, if you have questions about what you are ingesting, you should always ask your actual doctor. But before harvesting trees, right, I'm going to give you a whole list of trees that have edible flowers, roots, bark, sap, all you name it, right? Before you just go out and harvest willy nilly without abandon, you want to make sure, and this kind of ties into sustainable harvesting, which we will talk about later. But you want to make sure that number one, you've identified the tree correctly, right? It would be terrible. You're out here trying to have a good time and you incorrectly identify something and it winds up being toxic. Not the greatest. Make sure you have permission to harvest. If it is not in your own property, you always, always, always need to make sure that you have permission. A lot of state parks, nature centers, they are trying to protect the plants on their property, and they may have foraging rules and regulations that you need to abide by. Easiest thing to do is call the person, call the park, the organization, and say, hey, do you have any foraging regulations I need to be aware of? Is this allowed? If it's your neighbor, it might be a little bit more of a friendly sort of thing of saying, hey, can I harvest from this tree on your property? It's really beautiful. I'll make you a bottle of syrup as a thank you gift, right? And not only now are you kind of engaging that person in the art of foraging and showing them how cool it is, but you're getting them involved and excited about it. So just make sure you have permission. Know what parts of the tree to take, because again, not every part is going to do the same thing. You're not going to want to harvest the flowers, the bark, the sap, and the roots from every single tree that you come across. Some will only be leaves, some will only be flowers. You want to be conscientious of that. And again, we want to use sustainable harvesting methods, and we'll talk about that later on, what that might look like. So springtime, right now, we've got trees as food sources. Flowers overall tend not to be the most flavorful things. They are still very nutritious, but primarily because they are nectar sources for pollinators and wildlife, they're just going to be pretty sweet. This can be really obvious in things like red buds, crab apples, pear flowers, things like that. It just kind of has a mild sweet flavor to it. However, in trees like the magnolia, the flowers, these flowers were designed to be chewed up. These are ancient, ancient trees. And instead of having pollinators like butterflies, bumblebees, little flies coming and visiting the flowers, they had, because they're so ancient, they evolved alongside beetles. And these beetles they're called tumbling flower beetles. It's kind of funny to watch them operate. They just kind of roll around in the flower until they get down to the base of it, and then they can chew around the leaves to acquire the pollen that is their source. So that's kind of a funky, weird coevolution. But because the flowers were designed to be chewed, they're very flavorful. Magnolia happens, a lot of people compare it to ginger. So it's a very, very sweet petal, but it has a ton of flavor. You might see them on garnishes at like Asian restaurants that are utilizing that ginger flavor anyway. So eat those petals when you get them as garnishes. But these can make some really, really flavorful syrups, eating them raw. And it's not always a sweet dish that you have to create with them. You can be using them in more savory areas just due to that gingery flavor. Other common ones here are listed. We will talk about the black locust a little bit more, as that will be the flowers from the black locust are what I have as a tutorial kind of at the end, making a drink with black locust flowers. But other ones include Norway maples. And I highlighted the Norway maple and the Callery pear specifically because they are super duper invasive. And this means that we need to mitigate and manage the spread of these populations. As these trees flower, if we can harvest the flowers to eat them or utilize them for whatever wildcrafting excursion we have going on, we can prevent them from being pollinated, from turning into future seeds, and thereby preventing their spread, which can be really, really great. Plus, they are pretty nutritious, so that's fun too. In the summer and the fall, we can have more of the fruiting bodies, whether it's very obviously a fruit like the black cherry, we have our little cherry fruits, or something a little more like a staghorn sumac, which you can see here in this picture. They're super fuzzy and they taste very different depending on how you use it. In a lot of Mediterranean, Middle Eastern dishes, we have sumac used as a spice. And you can take these little fruits, they're almost like little tiny stones covered in fuzzy hair, and you can grind them down into a spice, a culinary spice, and they taste a little bit more earthy. But then if you take that whole stalk, that whole entire red thing, pop it in water, let it sit in the sun for a little bit and create a sumac sun tea. I find that now it has a more fruity flavor than a earthy, spicy flavor. And whenever I have made sumac vodka, sumac lemonade, whatever I'm making with sumac that's a liquid, I find that it's like a strawberry rhubarb sort of flavor, which is just really fun. Um, and the cool thing about the sumacs is that they can last a really long time. The fruits stay on there until the birds have picked them clean. So there's a chance that even though they grow up in June, start of June into July, you might be able to forage for some even in November. So that's always fun. And then we have the white mulberry here, who is an invasive species again. So if you can eat those little white mulberry, or I say white mulberry because that's the species of tree. However, the mulberries themselves are usually a deep pink to purpley color. But when you eat those mulberries, they are packed with antioxidants and great nutrients. So really good for us. And if we get them before the birds and the mammals do, again, we're mitigating the spread of seeds. American pawpaw is a lovely, lovely native, and they're really rare now within the forests of Pennsylvania. Most people who have a pawpaw they have one that they have specifically planted, which is absolutely great. However, this ties in a little bit to sustainable harvesting. Is as we identify, is this a native species? Is this an invasive species? We know how much we want to take. Pawpaw trees usually produce an absolute ton of fruit, and people try to give them away by the dozen. But as you're thinking about, okay, how are the fruits falling onto the ground? Wildlife are eating this, then spreading the seeds. You want to leave enough, even if you're like, oh, I really want to eat it. Don't let some of the fruits go to feed wildlife, because we can get stuff at the grocery store. Wild animals, nature is their grocery store, right? So we want to leave some for wildlife, and we also want to make sure that those seeds actually germinate to repopulate our forests with native pawpaws. But again, it produces a ton of fruits, so feel free to eat some of them. A lot of people compare them to having a mango-y slash banana sort of taste. I don't like bananas, and I still love pawpaws. I find them more on the mango side, flavor-wise. And texture too. It's like a very creamy sort of flesh on the inside. The seeds are super toxic. However, they are absolutely ginormous. So it's not like you're going to eat one accidentally. And as you're eating the pawpaw, you can just spit the seeds out. Kind of like an apple, right? If you get an apple seed or a watermelon seed, you just spit them out and you're okay. Then we've got, kind of in conjunction with trees for food, we've got trees for herbalism, right? So a lot of these go back to traditional plant medicines. And as we already talked about, any willow species is going to have anti-inflammatory and anti-pain kind of plant actions within them. Typically, in this day and age, we're not really chewing on the bark as much as drinking a tea that has been made from the bark or a tincture. Any willow is going to have this property again. They all have the salicylic acid. However, black willows were traditionally used the most. Then we have black cherry. And again, when we think of our cough syrup, might be that like reddish. I can taste it in my throat, on my tongue. Ugh, just thinking about it. It has that highly, highly medicinal flavor. That's because of all the stuff we add to it. But we can make cough syrup from black cherry bark. We want to make sure it's green bark. So the bark on the outside is going to be brown, but then when we peel it or if we're pruning branches, there's green tissue in it. It shows that it's living. If a branch or a piece of bark is just brown, there is no green tissue, typically in the winter, right? When everything's gone dormant, now there's toxins that have built up. So we always want to be harvesting the twigs and the bark from black cherries during the growing season. This can be used just like cough syrup does, but the stuff that we buy at the grocery store just tends to have a lot of other additives, pharmaceutical additives, to have other benefits as well. However, if we were just to create a black cherry bark syrup on our own, they would have a expectorant, so making productive coughs, as well as being kind of a little bit of a preventative as well. So if you start to feel like, oh, I have a cough or a cold coming along, and we can drink some of the syrup, we'll find that it mitigates some of the symptoms. And then there is black walnuts. So this is just one of my absolute favorites. You can use the bark, the nuts, the leaves for all sorts of wild crafting. However, the bark and the nuts can be used to create a drink that helps boost the waste systems of our body. So the skin, the liver, the kidneys, all of those, as well as the digestive system, because that's helping to process the nutrients in our body and move some toxins out. And I find the flavor to be extremely unique. It's like a very, very citrusy. So if you ever pick up a walnut, a black walnut, and you kind of rub the outer hull, it has a strong citrus smell to it. And that stays in the flavor too. So it's really, really fun and unique. But beyond just the bark or the leaves, we can also use flowers and fruits to have some sort of benefit to our bodies and our well-being. Any maple species, so that's going to be within the genus Acer, Acer, you can eat the flowers, eat the leaves. My personal favorite way is to air fry the leaves and create maple chips. Those are really, really delicious and really fun to make with Japanese maples or Norway maples. Those are the Norway maple is invasive. Japanese maple is a non-native ornamental. So I typically use those. However, red maple, sugar maple, silver maple, they all have this as well. However, they have, as this says, over 300 beneficial compounds. That's a lot. Most things might have 10, 15. Maple is jam-packed with benefits. And not only can you just eat the flowers, I like to put the Norway maple flowers in salads, in paninis, sautés, whatever. But you can also use it externally too. So creating an infused oil using the leaves and the young leaves and flowers can create a nice muscle rubs to reduce muscle tension, as well as, again, just like many of the other plants, including the black walnut, can boost our waste removal systems. American spicebush, though, is one of our natives that we want to, as is Eastern red cedar, but we want to be a little more respectful of our harvesting techniques there. But I find that spicebush can be used as a cinnamon alternative. So if you are trying to forage, do everything around the holidays with foraged ingredients and you want to make your ginger snap cookies to bring to a holiday dinner, right? Making it with spice bush can be really, really fun. And it has benefits such as being digestive bitters, right? So it's improving our digestive capabilities from start to finish. It is stimulating digestion, which aids in nutrient absorption, as well as being diaphoretic, which means that it's going to help us sweat a little bit, which then means that we are sweating out toxins. So that's always fun. In Eastern Red Cedar, we can use the whole entire tree, which is a good time. However, for the most part, people tend to harvest the needles and the cones, which we call berries. The little like bluish berries that we call juniper berries, they're not actually berries. They are a fleshy cone produced by this conifer. However, for all intents and purposes, we can call them berries because they are super fleshy. They are jam-packed with all sorts of benefits for our liver, as well as then externally, they are great for cleansing the skin as well as tightening skin cells up. So a lot of people find that they use it in like an anti-aging sort of thing because it just tightens and firms up the skin cell junctions. I do want to make note though that cedar does have a very specific action for women. So if you are pregnant, do not have cedar. It can stimulate menstruation, which if you're having issues with menstruation, you're trying to get your cycle back, cedar can be really great for that. However, if you're pregnant, you do not want to stimulate that. Or if you're breastfeeding, right? So you want to be very aware of not just what you are harvesting, but what impact might it have on your body as well. So using field guides or online resources, just make sure you're not reading in reputable resources. You want to read stuff that is scientifically accurate. So going to .orgs, going to .edus, more professional resources will give you some accurate information. So that's just a list of a tiny, itty bitty little fraction. There are thousands of plants worldwide that can be used for food. But we've got some other uses too that I want to highlight. And we don't have time in an hour for me to go over the thousands of plants that we can utilize. But even today, we've got lots of ways that plants are utilized from, think the lumber industry, we've got logging. Whittling is more of a outdoor wilderness survival type thing. You're making your own spoons and utensils and tools. We've got weavings. So a lot of people who are involved in survival work, bushcraft type activities might still be making weavings today, or just trying to keep a cultural activity alive, right? And then we've got botanical dye. So utilizing the pigments found within plants to create textiles, which then goes to sustainable fashion, right? So botanical dye tends to be what I personally do the most of in terms of how do we use plants without putting them in our bodies. So these three are trees that can create beautiful, beautiful dyes. Again, there's a lot more out there, but these are my personal favorites. Two can be found natively. One is an ornamental, or we can find them in flower arrangements a lot. But black walnut, as the name implies, can create a really, really dark, dark hue. And the nuts themselves create this beautiful coffee color. It's one of my favorites to dye with. However, the leaves can also be utilized to create a dye, and that's going to be more of a yellowy, bronzy, coppery sort of color. The crabapple, the bark, so as you are picking up storm damage or you are pruning your tree, you can utilize those twigs and that inner bark tissue to create this really nice kind of peachy color. And I always make my dye with crabapple with cold water, whereas black walnut I make with hot water. And some varieties of crabapples or malice You've got your Melis genus and your Prunus species, your Prunus genus. Prunus is going to be more of your pears. Malus is going to be more of your apples. Prunus is cherry. I apologize. Prunus is your cherries, not pears. Um, but they can create more of a yellowy sort of dye. So depending on what species you have, you might get some different colors from it. And then eucalyptus, while it does not grow natively here, it is an Australian tree. Um, we use eucalyptus a lot in flower arrangements. And so if you have a flower arrangement that you got or you found some at the grocery store, you can easily take those branches out and use them after, the rest of the bouquet has kind of faded. We can use the eucalyptus though to create a nice like slate gray dye. Absolutely beautiful. And all of these plants that I have mentioned, the black walnut, the crabapple, and the eucalyptus, can be used just with the plant steeped in water, whether you use hot or cold water, right? There's different processes. The eucalyptus and the walnut, I use hot. The crabapple, I use cold. But that's all you need for them. They have a lot of pigments inside them, and they have something called tannins. And the tannins found within the plant are these chemicals that actually help bind the pigment to the fiber that you are creating a shirt or whatever your fabric, your yarn, your wool, things like that with. When you are considering using botanical dyes, many plants, though, require the use of something called a mordant. And that is a chemical listed here. I have iron, alum, and copper as kind of the most common ones that will increase the color fastness of the dye. But if you've got a lot of tannins, like these plants do, the three that I mentioned here, you don't need a mordant because the tannins act as the mordant itself. So these are just some more fun ways to utilize plants. But we have all these cool ideas, from adding them to our diets culinarily or creating infused oils to make muscle rubs, hand salves, things like that, to then more practical purposes of sustainable fashion, or you're making your own bushcraft tools, things like that. We want to make sure that we are harvesting our plant matter sustainably. So this diagram here has a lot of information on it, but really we want to focus on that left tree cookie that shows the anatomy of the tree itself. So bark, that outer layer, that's called the epidermis, just like our skin. And just like our skin, that's the first line of defense. So if we get a cut, now that's a path of entry for pathogens, right? That's no good. We don't want that. When we are harvesting from a tree and we are using nippers to prune or shears, or we're peeling off little bits of bark, we are now creating little mini wounds that can potentially be sites of entry for pathogens. So we really want to be conscientious of how we are treating our trees. These are living creatures around us. And while sustainable harvesting methods can actually stimulate further growth, if we're not doing this properly, we can cause a lot of stress to the tree as they try to heal. And then if a pathogen, a bug, a fungus gets in, we can cause a lot of tree illnesses, even eventual death to the tree. So we want to be really conscientious of that as stewards of our environment. So these are things to consider for ethical and sustainable harvesting. The first, we've touched on it a little bit, is the plant a native tree or is it an invasive one? For the most part, a 1-to-3 ratio, so like 30%, is pretty okay. However, if it is a native species, try not to take more than 10%. Trees are pretty big, so that still gives you a lot of flowers or twigs to utilize, or fruits, right? But you, like we mentioned with the pawpaw, you want to leave some for wildlife to enjoy. You want to leave enough so that the tree can function as intended. You also want to leave some so that the tree produces the flowers that get pollinated, that then produce seeds that are spread. If the tree is super stressed out and injured, it now has to divert some of that flower producing energy. It takes a lot to healing from a wound. So we want to be really conscientious about that. If it's an invasive tree, though, we don't want it here. It's causing ecological harm. So let's benefit from this invasive tree in some capacity. And as we are mitigating its spread, we have some practical applications. So go beyond that 10%, go beyond the 1 to 3 ratio too. You also want to think of what is the local population size. Again, there's a big difference between red maple populations, that's a native tree, and the American pawpaw, that you can look at our Pennsylvania forests and be really hard pressed to find a pawpaw. Red maples, not so much. They're pretty prevalent. So even if, we're like, oh, well, here's a pawpaw, it's only one pawpaw, right, in the area, or there might be hundreds of red maples. Think about that too. How will you foraging from this one single rare species, even if it's delicious and edible, how will that impact the population in the future versus you taking the leaves and flowers from the native red maple, where there are hundreds in this riparian zone area, for example, right? So think about that. And then finally, we want to think about our proper pruning cuts. If you can harvest from storm damage, it's not going to be as easy to do with black cherry because, again, we want it to have that living tissue in it. But if you're utilizing it for botanical dye, right, that can be a great way to just pick up pieces. If you have an arborist coming out and doing work on your trees, ask them to set aside some of the bark for you because they're just going to go off and chip it anyway. So see if you can utilize it, right? But if you don't have these more sustainable methods and you want to go out and cut yourself, not yourself, but cut the tree yourself, then you just want to make sure that you are harvesting correctly. So in this image here, again, of the willow, you can see that where the little branch comes off this main curvy branch, there's this like swollen, sort of tightly packed bark at the junction of where the little twig meets the main branch. This is called the node or the branch collar. Within that swollen wood is a lot of chemicals called plant growth hormones. And these, when the branch is pruned at that branch collar, all those growth hormones are now stimulated and they say, okay, we see that a branch has fallen off. We're going to help this area heal and make another branch, put another bud out. It's also a site of stem cells. So just like our bodies that have stem cells that, for example, people who need transplants, organ transplants, might use stem cell therapy to kind of regrow little sections and pieces because stem cells don't have a job yet. They haven't defined themselves as a skin or a liver or an eyeball or a brain tissue yet. And the same in plants. The stem cells found within the branch collar, they don't have a job. They could become a root. They could become a bud. They could become a leaf, a flower, bark, tissue. So when we cut at that area very specifically, you don't want to cut flush. You want to leave tiny little, right where I have that dotted line, want to cut at a slight angle so that water can run off and it doesn't collect, but also at that branch color so that those hormones and those stem cells can work together to actually make the plant grow even better. So think of the deer that come and eat at plants or storm damage. This is how trees have adapted to all of these kind of environmental stressors and issues, is by putting these growth hormones there. However, if we were to nip back at, you can see I'm wearing a ring on my thumb. If we were to nip back kind of where my ring is on that twig, There's no growth hormones there. There's no specialized stem cells. So it kind of is just in this kind of weird stasis of, I need to heal. There's now a cut here, but it takes a lot of energy. And eventually, even once that site of entry calluses over, the plant can still send energy to that branch, not knowing that the branch is kind of like the phantom pains that amputees have, right? Where the body doesn't quite know that something is missing. It's the same in the trees, and it can still divert energy to that branch, even though the branch, for its intended purposes, has been removed, right? So, cutting, nice there, preventing cutting with actual tools rather than just breaking or twisting a branch off. That's kind of like a hangnail that then can rip farther down. If we pull off a hangnail instead of cutting it, that's now creating a bigger wound. So we want to use the right tools at the right place, and that can actually help the tree. All right, so now we have gotten to the end. So I have a little tutorial here. This is inspired by one of the recipes in my book, Trails to Tasting. There is a how to make a cordial, and this is my favorite cordial to make. And we are coming up on black locust time. Black locust is a wonderful native tree. It is a lovely tree for forest specializers, so bee pollinators that require forest trees. However, they produce a ton of flowers. So taking enough to make a little bit of cordial is not even going to be getting near the 10%. We're going to start seeing them in May. They do only bloom for about 1 week. So when you start seeing the black locust producing their little buds, you want to keep your eyes on it for when they produce these little pea-shaped flowers. The flowers, I find, have that mild sweet sort of flavor. However, the reason I really like black locust is because I also find that they taste like apples. So they have they just taste like apples. So a nice kind of tart, a mellow tart flavor. Um, but they're pretty pungent for a flower, which can be really exciting. So keep an eye on those. These aren't our native trees, so you might be able to find them around where you are, in your wood lot near you, at parks, other places. So you're going to create this cordial, and a cordial is just a alcohol-based syrup, pretty much. And you can use it to flavor cocktails. You can, here I have it just a cordial over ice. Can be really delicious as well. So to make it, you will need about 2 cups of the flowers. And again, keep your eye out for when they're in bloom. You're going to need vodka or any other sort of clear alcohol. You can use rum as well, tequila. You're going to want a quart mason jar, a saucepan, and a coffee filter, or I use a pasta strainer when I'm done to strain the plant matter out. And then your sweetener, which I typically use a cane sugar, white sugar. You can use a honey or a maple syrup as well, depending on what your preferences are. But to create this cordial, all you're going to do is fill your jar with these flowers. You want to make sure that there are no bugs on it, no little bugs, no little twigs. So remove the debris, add the flowers to your jar, and top it off with your alcohol. You're going to let that sit for a couple of days. I typically let mine sit for 3, and you'll start to see that the flowers turn from this white and yellow to translucent. All of the pigments, everything has been pulled out of the flower into the alcohol. And once that happens, you can kind of give a little taste test. Stick your finger in, lick it, pour yourself a little bit, taste it, and you'll see if does it taste like just straight vodka, or does it taste like there's some cool, weird, sweet apple stuff in there, right? Let it sit a couple of extra days, like 1 or 2 more days if you don't like the flavor yet. But typically after 3 days, it'll have pulled everything out. Strain out your flowers, and then measure the remaining liquid. That's going to come in handy when we create the syrup. Pour that into a saucepan and turn it on low heat. If you turn it on high heat, that will degrade the plant chemicals and plant compounds within this. Right now, you just have a tincture or an infusion. Then you're going to add a 1-to-1 ratio of sugar. So, however much liquid you measured, that's how much sugar or sweetener you're going to want to add. And you're going to stir that into the liquid until it has dissolved. So, that's why the low heat is going to help enable the sugar to be dissolved while not ruining or degrading your nutrients. Then take that off the heat once it's all dissolved, bottle it, and you can store it for probably like 1 or 2 weeks. It'll stay, actually, this is a cordial, not just a syrup. So if it was just a syrup, so a water-based syrup instead of an alcohol-based syrup, it would be 1 or 2 weeks. Cordials, though, can last like a year because they're alcohol-based. And then you can serve it. Here in the example picture, I had just have the cordial chilled on the rocks. It's delicious. You can add some of the flowers as garnishes, or in any sort of cocktail that you're making that calls for a cordial, you can substitute it. Or if it calls for a syrup, a simple syrup, you can substitute it there as well. Just keep in mind, if you're substituting a cordial for a simple syrup, that you are now increasing the amount of alcohol that is utilized in the drink. So it might be a little strong. But otherwise, that's just one example of the ways that we can be utilizing the trees that are going to be blooming in this time frame. So thank you so much for joining me today. The image here is of the mulberry, the white mulberry, which is going to, it is in bloom right now. So we're recording this right before Arbor Day. However, the fruits are going to come around kind of in June, July timeframe, and they're absolutely delicious. But if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. My Facebook, email, and website are up here. I will have this recording available on YouTube as well, so you can comment on YouTube if you have any questions. And I will absolutely get back to you because this is such a fun way to explore the natural world around us. Thanks. Stop sharing. Well, any questions, Louise?
No, thank you.
Yeah.
Actually, I did have one quick question.
Yeah.
When you say the inner bark, do you just mean like smaller like branches and stuff, or like literally in like scrape off the top bark and go for the inner part?
Yeah, so the inner stuff is the stuff that's deep inside. So when we think we have the epidermis and then we have the dermis, so we get a paper cut and that's usually just the epidermal layer. We get like a scraped knee and that scrapes down deeper. Same thing for the tree. So the easiest and most sustainable way to get that is by just clipping the whole branch and pruning that. Because if you were to go to a tree and just kind of gouge in and rip off a chunk of really thick bark and getting it so that the entire piece of bark is removed and you're now down to the wood on the inside, you've now removed a lot of the vascular tissue too. Which is not the greatest thing for it. So the easiest way is when you go to prune and you have a twig that contains it all.
Right. So you use the whole twig?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I have a crabapple tree that part of it fell, a big branch fell.
Yeah.
And I didn't know if you meant use the entire twig or like scrape from the branch and go inside of it a little bit.
I would recommend the first option just because that's the least amount of work. It's going to be way easier just to do that rather than like scraping it off. Like if you take the whole twig, all of that is going to be there. I would just chop it up into like thumb length pieces, just to put more space, right, for where the twigs are touching whatever your liquid base is.
And for the walnut tree, you take the bark?
You can take the bark, the walnut tree is like a fully lovely thing. So you can, depending on what you're doing, you can take the bark, the nuts, the leaves, the roots.
I have one. I'm not sure how well it's doing. It had a bunch of fruit one year and then not the next year, and
They
then
do that.
yeah,
Yeah, any sort of nut producing tree. So our native oaks do the same thing. They'll go through
yeah,
mast cycles where they produce a lot, and then next year they might produce a little bit. And one
yeah,
year they might not produce too much of anything at all.
yeah.
And then
It's
produce,
on the edge of our property, so I don't like look at it that much, but
yeah.
I'll go make sure or go check on
Yeah,
it.
see if any around June 23rd is St. John's Day, and that's like a really key day for foragers.
Yeah.
That is when black walnuts are at peak for making an Italian liqueur called Nocino,
Mm-hmm.
and they like hang down. So if any are hanging down low enough,
All right.
that's the
I'll
day
go
to
check
kind of, or
on
like around that time is the day to check
that.
on them.
Okay, I will. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. It was good to
Have a
see you
good day.
again.
You too.
Yeah,
Bye.
bye.